The candles in the Ashmore assembly rooms were too many and too bright, and Cecily Vane had nowhere to stand where their light did not find her. She had known when she dressed that evening that the blue wool was beyond saving. The nap had worn smooth at both elbows, and across the left shoulder where she carried her sewing basket, and the hem, which she had let down twice already, still fell half an inch shorter than fashion required. She had pressed it with a damp cloth and a cool iron, and told herself it would serve. She had been telling herself that for 3 seasons now, and every season the telling grew harder. The room filled around her. Muslin floated in from the door in pale clouds. Diamonds caught the candle flames and scattered them in small, cold fires across the ceiling. Lady Farwell arrived in gold satin with her daughter Georgiana beside her. Georgiana in white with blonde lace at the sleeves. And the room turned as one to note their entrance. No one turned for her. She was simply present, the way a chair was present, or a candlestick, or anything else the room used, without thinking about. She had arrived with Mrs. Bland. Peel, her father's old neighbor who had offered to bring her as an act of charity so transparent. It made the skin on the back of Cecily's neck prickle. Mrs. All? Peel had already found a friend near the pianoforte, and was deep in conversation about someone's unfortunate third son. Cecily stood beside the window at the far side of the room, her gloved hands folded, and watched the evening prepare to happen without her. She did not see the Viscount Aldwych until he was already in the room. He came in quietly for a man of his rank, without the announcement of name and title that his consequence warranted, and paused just inside the door with his hands clasped behind his back, and a look on his face that was not quite boredom and not quite ease. Tall, dark coat, white cravat folded with the precision of a man who had learned that precision, in a room full of people watching for weakness, was its own armor. He scanned the assembly with gray eyes that moved without haste, and for one suspended moment his gaze crossed Cecily's corner of the room before continuing its survey. She told herself he had not seen her. She was in the ordinary run of things quite easy to miss. The assembly room's verdict on her had been rendered and was not contested. She was the daughter of a clergyman 3 years in his grave, living now on the courtesy of distant connections and the small income of £12 a year that remained after the living passed to another. She was 23, which the season had already decided was late. She was, as Lady Farwell had said to Mrs. Peel, the previous winter within Cecily's hearing, rather worn-looking for her age. The phrase had been spoken with the particular gentleness of a woman who knows she is being unkind and has chosen to do it anyway, the genteelness of the delivery making the content more cutting for the dressing. Worn-looking. As though she were a piece of upholstery, rather than a person who had spent the last 3 years managing her father's final illness on a household income that shrank with every month. She pressed her gloved fingers together and looked at the floor. The musicians struck up a country dance, and the floor opened to receive it. Cecily watched the couples arrange themselves and felt, as she always felt in these first moments, the specific loneliness of being present at an occasion that has decided, before it began, that you are not part of it. If there are any among you who have stayed until now who know the particular silence of a ballroom that has looked at you and looked away, you will understand precisely what she carried to that window. She almost did not hear the footstep beside her. Miss Vane. She turned. The Viscount Aldwych stood 2 feet away, his hands still behind his back, his expression still not quite readable. He was closer than she had expected. His face at this distance was less perfectly composed than it had appeared from across the room. There was something in the set of his jaw that she could not name. "My lord," she said, and dipped into a curtsy that was correct because it had to be. "I believe," he said, "that this set is not yet promised." She looked at him. He was looking at the dancers, not at her, and his voice had been level and quiet and entirely uninflected, as though he were reading from a ledger. She had been attending assemblies in this county for 3 seasons and had danced, in that time, precisely 7 times, none of those times with a man of any particular consideration. She understood in a cold, clear way that what was happening could not be what it appeared to be. "It is not," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. She told herself as the floor received them that she was simply being practical, that there was some reason she could not see, some social geometry in which this made sense to him, some obligation being discharged. She was not the kind of woman to whom a viscount offered his hand in a public assembly without cause. She was, as the room had long since agreed, rather worn-looking for her age. His hand, when the dance brought them together, was steady. She did not look at his face. The room, however, looked at both of them. She had come to Ashmore in the first week of autumn at the invitation of her cousin Agnes, who lived with her husband in a respectable house on the edge of the market town, and whose charity was considerably warmer and less pointed than Mrs. Malley Peel's. Agnes had 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 4, and a husband who spent most of his time in his study. Cecily helped with the children. She taught Edmund his letters in the morning and walked with both children in the afternoons when the weather allowed, and in the evenings she mended clothes and read from the parish library, and did not think too carefully about the future, because the future, when examined directly, had a quality of blankness that she found it best not to stare at too long. She was not unhappy. She had learned over the 3 years since her father's death to inhabit a very small life, with a kind of precise and deliberate care, the way you might live carefully in a house whose roof you knew to be fragile. She took pleasure where it presented itself. In Edmund's progress with his letters, in the way the morning light fell through the schoolroom window, in a well-written page of the novel that Agnes sometimes lent her. These were not large pleasures, but they were consistent, and she had trained herself to be grateful for consistency. She had not trained herself to be grateful for being told within earshot that she was worn-looking. The morning after the assembly, she had returned to the schoolroom and found Edmund already at his desk with a copybook, which he held up for her inspection with an expression of transparent pride. The letters were large and uneven, and 3 of them faced the wrong direction. But they were his, and she had praised them with a warmth that was entirely genuine, and the day had gone on from there. She had not expected to see Lord Aldwych again. She had, therefore, been wholly unprepared for the afternoon he appeared at the garden gate. Agnes had taken the children to visit a neighbor, and Cecily was in the front garden cutting back the last of the roses, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her good gloves left inside because she was past caring about the good gloves in the garden. She heard the creak of the gate and looked up, and there was the Viscount Aldwych standing at the entrance to Agnes's kitchen garden, in a coat the color of dark water, looking at her with an expression she could not quite resolve. She straightened. Her hands were dirty. She became aware of them very suddenly. "My lord," she said. "Miss Vane." He did not open the gate, which she would have understood as a proper social distance, but neither did he withdraw, which she would have understood as a brief intrusion quickly corrected. He simply stood there. "I came to call on your cousin. She is from home." "Ah." A pause. She watched him decide something. "I will leave my card." He reached into his coat and produced a card and held it over the garden gate. She walked to the gate and took it. Their gloved hands did not touch. She was not wearing her gloves. The card was thick cream stock, the name engraved in plain letters, Richard Aldwych, Viscount Aldwych, of Hawthorne. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her hands, which still held the pruning shears. She became aware that she was holding pruning shears. "You have been cutting back the roses," he said. It was not a question. She was, accordingly, not sure what it was. "The late ones needed it before the frost," she said. He looked at the rosebed. She looked at him, looking at the rosebed. He had very gray eyes, she noticed, and they moved with a kind of methodical attention, the way a man looks at a thing he is genuinely trying to understand, rather than at a thing he is simply looking at to be polite. "My mother's roses at Hawthorne were always done before the first week of October," he said. "It is the 16th, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something that a smile might become, given the right conditions and sufficient time. He looked back at her. She looked back at him. The moment lasted longer than it should have, and she felt the length of it in her sternum, a small, measured pressure. "Good afternoon, Miss Vane," he said. He left. She stood in the garden with his calling card in her dirty hand, and told herself quite firmly that this meant nothing at all. She told Agnes the same thing that evening when Agnes held the card and raised her eyebrows and said, in the tone of a woman who is being extremely careful, that it was very kind of the Viscount to call. He came on business, Cecily said. He left when he found you from home. Agnes set the card on the mantelpiece and said nothing further, which was, Cecily reflected, considerably more eloquent than words. The second time was at the lending library. Cecily went on Thursdays when the new periodicals came in and spent half an hour reading beside the window before taking out the one novel she permitted herself each week. She was midway through a passage about the management of bees when she heard the door and looked up from habit and found him. He did not see her immediately. He went to the far shelf and stood with his back to the room, one gloved hand moving along the spines. Cecily looked back at her periodical and read the same sentence about bees 3 times. She heard his step before she saw him again. Miss Vane, he had the air of a man who was not quite surprised. You favor the lending library on Thursdays. I do, she said. She set the periodical in her lap. Do you? I find myself passing this way, he said, which was not precisely an answer. He looked at the periodical in her lap, The Management of Bees. It is a very informative piece, she said. He drew out the chair at the table across from her, paused with his hand on the back of it, and then sat down in it. She watched him do this. He opened the volume he had taken from the shelf, which she could not see the title of, and began to read, or appeared to read. She was not entirely certain whether he was reading or whether he was, as she was, looking at a page without seeing it. They sat for a quarter of an hour in a silence that should have been awkward, and was instead something else. Cecily could not name what it was, which worried her slightly. She was, in general, quite good at naming things. When she rose to return the periodical, he rose also. I will walk back along the high street, he said. If you go that way. I do, she said. They walked back along the high street. He did not offer his arm, which would have been too pointed, but he walked at her left shoulder at a distance that was exactly proper, and somehow, in its exactness, more significant than proximity would have been. He asked about the children. She told him about Edmund's letters. He listened in the way of a man who was genuinely attending, his head tilted slightly, his eyes on the pavement ahead. He turned 3 of them the wrong way, she said. But he held the pen correctly, which is harder at 6 than it sounds. I turned my letters the wrong way until I was 8, Lord Aldwych said. My father was not pleased. She glanced at him. He was looking ahead. Were you afraid of him? She asked, which she had not intended to ask and which was far too forward, and she felt the heat of the mistake immediately. But he did not stiffen. He considered it with the same methodical attention he had given the rose bed, as though it were a question worth the consideration it asked. No, he said after a moment. I wanted very much to be what he expected. That is different from fear. She looked at the pavement. Yes, she said. I think it is. They parted at the corner, and she walked the rest of the way to Agnes's house, feeling that something had shifted in the air around her, the way the quality of light changes before a storm. Not threateningly, but with a new weight, a new attention to everything it touches. The assembly 3 weeks later was Lady Farwell's, held at Farwell Park, and Cecily attended it because Agnes's husband had business with someone who would be present, and Agnes could not go alone. Lady Farwell received her guests at the door with the warmth of a woman who has measured every arriving guest against her expectations, and found most of them wanting. She received Cecily and Agnes with a smile that did not quite reach the eyes, and a downward flick of attention that took in less than 2 seconds, every feature of Cecily's dress. Cecily was wearing the blue wool again. There was nothing else, Miss Vane, Lady Farwell said. How fortunate for your cousin that she has your company. A pause of perhaps a quarter of a second, precisely timed. One does what one can with limited resources. Agnes's hand tightened on Cecily's arm. Cecily smiled and said, quite steadily, that she was grateful for the invitation. She moved on into the room. Georgiana Farwell was in pale pink muslin, attended by 3 young men and by Lord Aldwych, who was standing beside the pianoforte with his hands behind his back and an expression of patient courtesy, while Georgiana said something that made one of the young men laugh. Cecily saw him before he saw her. She watched him for a moment she could not account for. Then he turned his head, and their eyes met across the room. He crossed to her. She was aware, with a cold clarity, that Georgiana Farwell was watching him cross, and that her expression had gone very still. "Miss Vane," he said. "Good evening." He looked at Agnes and Mrs. Hollis. Agnes returned his bow with a smile that she could not quite keep from being too wide. "Lord Aldwych," Cecily said. "I did not know you were acquainted with Lady Farwell. I have known her ladyship these 20 years, he said. "It would be ungracious not to attend." He paused. His eyes moved briefly to the left shoulder of her dress where the nap was worn. She felt the movement of his gaze like a physical thing. He looked back at her face. "May I claim the first dance?" She heard somewhere behind her the specific quality of a conversation that has just lost interest in itself and begun paying attention to something else. "You may," she said. The country dance opened. He was, she discovered, a precise and unhurried dancer, the kind that makes his partner look better than she is. And she was not, in fact, a poor dancer, only an unpracticed one. She concentrated on the figures and tried not to notice how close he was when the dance brought them together, or how the candles found his face in the turn. It was when they paused in the line, while the couple below them danced down, that she heard it, behind her. Near enough that she was not intended not to hear. Lady Farwell spoke to Mrs. Reeve, in a voice calibrated for the purpose. "One feels for the girl," Lady Farwell said with a sigh of considerable care. "Quite threadbare in making the most of it. Very valiant, though it does make one wonder what Aldwych can be thinking, attending to her so particularly. One does not like to say charity, and yet the pause was everything." "Charity," Mrs. Reeve said, completing it. Cecily held her face still. The dance brought her partner back to her, and she took his offered hand, and turned with him, and she did not let her expression do what it wanted to do. He was looking at her. He had very gray eyes, and they were on her face with that same methodical care, and she thought, in the turned-over place where such thoughts lodge, that he had heard it too. He said nothing. The dance continued. She was, she told herself, accustomed to this. She was not, in fact, accustomed to it, but she had learned to tell herself so. The library at Hawthorne had been his wife's. He had not been inside it in 3 years, not since the winter Catherine died. The housekeeper dusted it. The gardener brought in wood for the grate on the days the house was opened. He himself moved through it when he must. On his way between rooms, with the deliberate neutrality of a man walking through a room that has become a kind of weather, Catherine had loved it extravagantly. She had loved every room in the house, with a particularity that still sometimes surprised him by its absence. Walking through the gallery and expecting to hear her voice, and finding only the house's ordinary silence instead. She had died in March. 3 years ago now. The child had come too early and not survived, and she had not survived the week, and he had stood in the doorway of the room where she was laid out and felt something close in him with the quiet finality of a book whose covers have come together and will not again be opened. He had been managing that closure ever since. He was quite good at it. He was, in general, quite good at managing things. He had learned as a young man that the appearance of composure was nearly indistinguishable from composure itself if you held it long enough. And he had held it long enough that he had ceased to be entirely certain of the difference. Cecily Vane had looked at him over the garden gate in the middle of the afternoon, with dirty hands and a pair of pruning shears, and said, "The late ones needed it before the frost, and something had moved in him that he had not expected." It was not a large thing. It was the quality of a woman who is attending to what is actually in front of her, rather than to what she wants to see there. She had not been performing composure. She had simply been present, in the way of someone who has learned to be fully where they are because where they are is all they have. He recognized it. He was not entirely certain he had a right to. He had begun calling at Mrs. Hollis's house with a frequency that his steward, a man of 20 years' service and the most tactful of countenances, had noted without comment. He had been to the lending library on Thursday, which was not his usual day. He had attended Lady Farwell's assembly, which he had been avoiding for 7 weeks on the reasonable grounds that Lady Farwell had been making clear since October, that she considered Georgiana the natural successor to the vacancy his late wife had left, and that he was past ready to find it so. He was not, as it happened, finding it so. He knew, as he stood in Lady Farwell's drawing-room and watched the color hold steady in her face while she processed what had just been said behind her, that he had arrived at the edge of something. She would not say anything. She was too practiced at not saying anything. She would take it home with her and add it to the collection of such things she had been carrying for however long she had been carrying them, and it would make that collection heavier, and she would continue to carry it. He supposed, several. The dance ended. He returned her to Agnes's side. He did not say what he might have said, because the middle of Lady Farwell's dancing-room was not the place for it, and because she, he suspected, would not have thanked him for a scene. She was too precisely civil for scenes. He said instead that he hoped she would take some refreshment, and she said, "Yes." "Thank you," and he went to find her a glass of negus. Lady Farwell was beside him at the refreshment table before he had quite finished pouring. "You are very attentive to Miss Vane," she said with the warmth of a woman who has chosen her ground. "I am attentive to many of my acquaintances," he said. "She is a sweet girl." Lady Farwell smiled. "In her way. Though of course she has nothing, and one must be sorry for her. The threadbare gown, you know. One does not like to remark on it, but everyone does. Of course I believe she has only the one." He looked at Lady Farwell. He let the look be longer and quieter than was quite comfortable. "I believe," he said, "that what Miss Vane has or does not have is not among your ladyship's concerns." Lady Farwell's smile did not waver, but something behind it recalculated. She said something gracious and moved away. He returned to Cecily with the glass. She took it and thanked him. Her eyes over the rim of the glass were steady and a little guarded. He had seen that guardedness for weeks. Now the particular cautiousness of a person who has learned that things that appear to be offers are frequently not offers. "I will call on Mrs. Hollis tomorrow afternoon," he said, keeping his voice low and level. And he hoped giving nothing away that she was not yet prepared to receive. "If you will be at home." She held the glass carefully. "I will be at home," she said. He nodded. He moved away. He was, he thought, being patient, which was not precisely in his nature but which the situation required. The following morning Cecily rose at 6 and supervised Edmund's breakfast and walked both children in the garden for an hour, and then retreated to the schoolroom and sat looking at Edmund's copybook without seeing it, because she was thinking about the precise quality of Lord Aldwich's voice when he had said he would call, and what, if anything, she was supposed to do with that. The difficulty was that she did not know what he wanted. She was not, she told herself quite firmly, one of those women who assumes the worst of a gentleman's attentions, but neither was she one of those women who assumes the best without evidence. She was, in general, a woman who looks at what is actually present, and names it with as much accuracy as she can. What was actually present was a man who had danced with her twice in 3 weeks, come to the lending library on a day that was not his usual day, appeared at the garden gate on an afternoon that she was alone, and said, with the manner of a man who had made some internal decision, that he would call. She did not know what the decision was. She was afraid to speculate, because speculating would require her to want something, and wanting something, in her experience, was the reliable precursor to not having it. Agnes came in at 10:30 with a cup of tea, and the expression of a woman who has been waiting very patiently for an invitation. "He is coming today," Agnes said. "He said he would call," Cecily said. "That is not the same as anything." Agnes sat down across the schoolroom table and said nothing, which was her most eloquent method. "Agnes," Cecily said, "he is a viscount. I am the penniless daughter of a clergyman with 1 dress." "You have 2 dresses," Agnes said. "You have the blue wool and the grey serge. The grey serge is for funerals." Agnes smiled. "He came to the lending library on a Thursday. Perhaps he wanted a book. He has 500 books at Hawthorne. My husband has been there for a dinner. He says the library is very well appointed." Cecily looked at the copybook. Edmund had made a valiant attempt at the letter F, and it looked rather more like a man falling than a letter. But the intention was clear. "I am not going to hope," she said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said very gently, "Cecily, you are allowed." He arrived at 3. Agnes took the children for a walk with conspicuous timing, and Cecily sat in the drawing room and waited and told herself she was simply a woman receiving a caller, and there was nothing in particular to make of it. He came in without the quality of a man making an entrance. He sat in the chair across from her and accepted the cup of tea, and then set it down on the table beside him, and said, with the directness of a man who has decided he is done with indirection, "I should like to tell you something if you will hear it." She set her own cup down. "I will hear it. 3 years ago I lost my wife," he said. He said it plainly, without flourish, the way you state a fact that has been a fact for long enough that you have made a kind of peace with its stating. "I have not been looking for anything since I had not thought to be." He paused. The pause was the length of a breath. "I began looking in September. I was not planning to." She looked at him. She was holding herself very still. "September," she said. "The first assembly," he said. He was standing at the window. She thought about saying something careful and decided against it. "I thought you had not seen me," she said. "I had seen you," he said. "I saw you at once." Something turned over in her slowly like a page. "I am aware," he said, "that I have given you no reason to think my attention was anything but courtesy. I was uncertain of myself, which is not a state I am accustomed to. I wished to be certain before I spoke." He looked at her with the gray eyes that moved with that particular careful attention. "I am certain now." She pressed her hands together in her lap. She was aware of them very specifically, the bones of her fingers, the worn patches on the inner seam of her gloves. "Lord Aldwych," she said, "I have very little. You are aware of that." "I am aware of precisely what you have," he said. "I have been paying attention," Lady Farwell said. She began and stopped. "Lady Farwell," he said several things last night. I do not consider them." She looked at him. She thought about the blue wool gown. She thought about the 3 seasons she had stood at windows, watching rooms happen around her. Sigh. She thought about Edmund's lopsided letter F, and the way she had praised it, with a warmth that was entirely genuine, because it was his, and it was real. And she had learned that what was real was worth attending to, even when it was small. "I do not know how to accept something I have not prepared for," she said. "Then I will ask you a simpler thing," he said. "Will you walk with me tomorrow morning, along the river, if the weather holds?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. The weather held. They walked along the river in the thin October light, and he did not offer his arm until they reached the turning where the path narrowed, and then he offered it as a practical matter, and she took it as a practical matter, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the river went on beside them. He told her about Catherine. He did not say a great deal. He said she had loved the library at Hawthorne, and that the child had come too early, and that he had been for a long time, a man who was very good at managing things and could not manage this. He said it looking at the river, his jaw set with the particular set of a man who has something he has not put into words often. "I am sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said. "I did not say it for sympathy." "I know," she said. "You said it because I should know it." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved again, that, not quite smile. "Yes," he said. She told him about her father, about the last 2 years of his illness and the parish bills and the £12 a year and the way she had packed the rectory herself, room by room, because there was no one else. and had stood in the doorway of his study afterward with the shelves empty and felt the particular grief of a finished thing, the specific weight of it. He listened the way he did everything, with full and methodical attention, without interrupting and without the softening interjections that she had learned meant a person was waiting for you to stop, rather than hearing what you said. "You pack the rectory yourself," he said when she had finished. "There was no one else," she said. "You have said that twice," he said. She looked at him. "You need not say it again," he said quietly. "You need not keep accounting for yourself." The river went on. A heron stood on the far bank and looked at nothing. The light moved through the trees. In the slow way of October, patient and amber and almost already past. She felt, in the place below thought where the body keeps its truest accounts, that something had been handed back to her. A thing she had set down so long ago she had ceased to notice its absence. They did not speak about it further. They walked back along the river, and he returned her to Agnes's gate, and lifted his hat, and said he would call on Tuesday. She said she would be at home. He went. She stood at the gate for a moment after the sound of his steps had faded. Agnes opened the front door and looked at her from the threshold with the expression of a woman who has been watching from the window. Cecily came inside. The second assembly at Farwell Park was a larger affair than the first. Lady Farwell had arranged it as a proper ball with a supper at midnight, and the rooms thrown open to twice their usual complement. Cecily came again with Agnes and her husband, and she wore the blue wool again, because she had no other choice, and she pressed it and pinned the left sleeve to hide the worst of the elbow, and told herself it would serve. She had been telling herself that for 3 seasons this time she was less sure she believed it. The rooms were fuller, the candles were impossibly more numerous. Georgiana Farwell was in white silk this time with pearls, and she was stationed near the entrance in a way that managed to suggest she had happened there by accident, while also making clear that she had not. Cecily found a place near the windows. Lord Aldwych arrived at 8. She knew when he arrived, because the quality of the room changed, the particular shift of attention that follows a man who is expected. He came directly to her. She watched him come and felt the watching of the room like a weight on both shoulders. "Miss Vane," he said. He bowed. His eyes moved over her face, and she knew, from having watched them now for long enough to know their vocabulary, that he was reading something he had decided to act upon. "My lord," she said. "Good evening." He offered his arm. "I hope you will give me the first 2 dances," she heard. Behind her, the precise silence of a room that has stopped one conversation to begin another. She took his arm. The first dance was a country dance, and the second was a waltz, which was still considered by half the county to be more forward than was quite proper, and he asked her for it without hesitation, which meant that he knew this and had decided. She danced it with him. She was aware, through the full quarter hour of it, that they were being watched with an intensity that had passed beyond casual interest into something more purposeful. At the supper interval he brought her food and sat beside her, and talked to her in the quiet way of a man who is not performing for the room, but is simply where he has chosen to be. She ate. She tried to attend to what he was saying, rather than to what the room was saying, about what he was doing. She was aware of Lady Farwell. She was aware of Lady Farwell in the way you are aware, of a pressure in the air before it becomes weather. It became weather at supper. Lady Farwell came to the table where Cecily sat between Agnes and an elderly gentleman she did not know, and she stopped behind Cecily's chair with the deliberateness of a woman who has prepared her position. Lord Aldwych was across the room, speaking with a man Cecily recognized as a local magistrate. "Miss Vane?" Lady Farwell said, addressing the room slightly more than she addressed Cecily. "How charming that you are here again. One does admire your perseverance." The pause she constructed was perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, she allowed her gaze to travel, for the 3rd time in Cecily's memory, over the blue wool gown with the patience of a surgeon noting symptoms. "Though I confess, one begins to wonder whether the Viscount's charity is quite wise. In the long run it is kindly meant, I am sure, but kindness of that sort can give rise to expectation. And expectations, in a girl of Miss Vane's station, can be so terribly disappointing to everyone. The room around the table heard it. The room around the table was designed to hear it. Cecily set down her fork. She had been here before. She had been here, in various forms, for 3 years, and she knew the correct response. The correct response was to say nothing, to smile, to fold her hands in her lap and outlast the moment. She had outlasted many moments. She was very good at outlasting moments. She could feel the old familiar calculus assembling itself. Say nothing. Draw no further attention. Let it pass. She looked at the blue wool on her arm. She looked at Agnes, who was looking at her, with an expression that was half warning and half something else. She picked up her fork. "Lady Farwell," she said with the steadiness she had been practicing for 3 years without knowing she was practicing it. "I am grateful for your concern. I do not share it." The table went very quiet. Lady Farwell's smile did not falter, but it changed quality, the way the surface of water changes quality when something moves beneath it. Lord Aldwych, Cecily realized, had returned to the table. She did not know how long he had been standing at the edge of it. His face was composed with the precision of a man who has decided exactly what he is about to do and is taking the time to do it correctly. He came around the table and stood at Cecily's shoulder. "Miss Vane," he said with a quietness that the table could hear entirely. He reached past her and lifted her glass and handed it to her, which was an intimacy of such ordinary domesticity in this public room that the table understood it before he said the next words. He looked at Lady Farwell. He looked at her with the gray eyes and the jaw set and the expression that was not coldness but was something firmer than composure. "Miss Vane and I are engaged," he said. The table did not move. "She has done me the honor," he said, "of accepting my proposal." Lady Farwell opened her mouth, closed it. Cecily was aware of the glass in her hand, the smooth, cool stem of it, the amber color of the wine inside. She was aware of him standing at her shoulder close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. She had not said yes to a proposal. He had not made one. She understood, with a clarity that arrived fully formed, that he had just made one, here, in front of 30 witnesses, that what he was offering her was the choice to accept it publicly before she had been asked privately, which was either the most high-handed thing anyone had ever done to her, or the most considered, and she was not certain which. And she thought she knew. She thought she knew. "You are very kind," Lady Farwell said, after a moment that had lasted as long as it needed to last. "Not particularly," Lord Aldwych said. He sat down beside Cecily. He sat down beside her with the ease of a man returning to a place he has decided is his, and he did not look at Lady Farwell again. And Lady Farwell, after a moment of standing behind Cecily's chair with the particular quality of a woman revising her position on several things at once, moved away. Agnes's hand found Cecily's arm under the table and pressed it once, and was still. Cecily held the glass and looked at the middle distance and felt the room arrange itself around a new fact. The dancing resumed. Somewhere behind her, Georgiana Farwell was saying something to her mother, in a low voice. The magistrate had moved to speak to someone else. The room went on with itself, as rooms do, incorporating the new piece of information and moving past it, leaving Cecily and the man beside her in a quiet that had a different quality now from any quiet she had occupied in a very long time. He said, "Very low for her alone. I should have asked you properly first." "I know it. You should have," she said. A pause. "Will you?" he said. She set the glass down. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the gray eyes, and the attention that moved over her face the way it had moved over the rose bed and the periodical page and the river, with the full and methodical care of a man who is looking at what is actually there. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, as though something had been formally confirmed. He reached for his own glass. He drank. After a moment he said, "The roses at Hawthorne will need to be cut back before the first frost." "I expect they will," she said. "I thought," he said, "that you might like to see the library first." She looked at him. "Catherine's library?" he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see the small cost of it in the steadiness with which he held his composure. I should like you to see it. It is a good library. I think she would have wished it used. She thought about the library at Hawthorne which she had not seen. She thought about a woman she did not know who had loved it. She thought about the afternoon light through a window, the way it might fall on shelves of books in a room she had not yet walked into. She thought about the garden at Hawthorne, the late roses that would need cutting back, the frost that was already coming, the winter that came after that, and the spring. I would like that very much, she said. The Viscount's license was confirmed 2 weeks later, arranged with a quiet efficiency that surprised no one who had seen how Lord Aldwych conducted his affairs. The Vicar of Ashmore read the banns on 3 successive Sundays to a congregation that had already read them in the form of Lady Farwell's retelling several times over. Agnes wept, briefly, at the wedding, and Edmund sat very straight in his good coat and whispered to his sister that Lord Aldwych was, in his considered opinion, all right. They went to Hawthorne on the first afternoon of the new year, through frost that lay along the road in long white lines and a sky the color of old pewter. The house stood at the end of its drive behind iron gates, gray stone, and many windows. The kind of house that has settled into its ground over so many years that it has stopped looking, placed, and started looking grown. Cecily had, in the weeks since the supper at Farwell Park, been in the habit of reminding herself that the world was the same world it had been in September, that she was the same person, that a declaration across a supper table did not alter the facts of who she was. She had reminded herself of this quite carefully, with the attention of a woman who had learned that careful attention was the only reliable thing. She still believed it. She simply found that it mattered less than she had thought. He showed her the library that afternoon, with the housekeeper hovering at the door, and the fire lit and the lamps already burning against the early winter dark. The shelves ran to the ceiling on 3 walls, and the window on the 4th looked out over the garden, which was frost-gray and bare now, the rose-beds cut back to their winter canes. In the center of the mantelpiece, between 2 candlesticks, stood a small painting in an oval frame, a young woman with dark hair and a quiet expression, looking somewhere beyond the painter with an attention that reminded Cecily, just slightly, of someone she knew. She looked at it for a moment. She did not say anything. Beside her, he was quiet. Then she turned to the shelves and ran her gloved finger along a row of spines, and she said, "You have the Cowper. I have been trying to find the Cowper for 2 months." He reached past her and took the volume down from the shelf and held it out. She took it. She held it in both hands. The worn brown cover of it, the good, solid weight, wet. Edmund's copybook was in her bag, because she had brought it to show him the letter F, which Edmund had finally turned the right way around. She would show it to him later by the fire, in the room she had not yet begun to think of as hers. By spring she thought she might have begun. The frost lay along the window glass in small white crystals, intricate and temporary. Beyond it, the garden waited for what came next. She opened the Cowper. She was home. If something in Cecily's story stays with you, leave a word in the comments. It is enough sometimes to say so.